Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about league-winning wide receivers for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be mentioning 7 wide receivers in specific who all share the league-winning wide receiver archetype. Now, when we look back at 2022, that archetype consisted of players that were rookies going into year 2, such as Jalen Waddle, Devonta Smith, and AMON-RA St. Brown, all players who had incredible success in their rookie campaigns, but were only able to develop on that and expand it to wide receiver 1 finishes in 2022. Now, when looking back at the 2022 season, there were also other players like an Amari Cooper and Christian Kirk who ended up finishing as a wide receiver 1 in 2022, despite the fact that throughout the entirety of August of 2022, they were drafted as a wide receiver 3 in our respective leagues, but all the variables that surrounded them were not apparent to us at the time, and hopefully we can utilize that knowledge in order to identify the next Amari Coopers and Christian Kirks going into this upcoming season. So that is the entire premise of today's video, talking about wide receivers who have league-winning upside. I'll of course present statistics and data that I've collected this offseason thus far in order to give you guys the justified reasons as to why I'm targeting these players at their current average draft position and why I truly believe they'll be able to surpass that ADP and give you league-winning upside with their overall efforts. Before we get into today's video, a reminder, if you guys haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy yet, again, we'll go ahead and expand upon it more. You can find all my rankings, my draft guide, and everything available. All you got to do is travel down to the description of the video, click on the link, use code Andrew today, and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. I'll go into more details, but what I primarily want to cover today is talking about these league-winning wide receivers and the upside that they have. Specifically, Garrett Wilson, the thumbnail of today's episode. We all know that he's going into year 2, and I've mentioned this on multiple occasions already this offseason, but I'll repeat it once again. Over the course of the last 5 seasons, 2017 through 2021, there have been 17 wide receivers ranked as top 36 wide receivers in their rookie year and a half PPR scoring format. So of those 17 wide receivers, 13 of them in year 2 once again repeated as top 36 players within their position. That's a 76.47% success rate. Now, when we take out the injured players like Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp who missed significant times in their second years, that means that 13 of the last 15 wide receivers who have been able to rank within the top 36 of their given rookie season have advanced into their sophomore campaign at an 88.23% success rate. Now, of those 15 wide receivers as a whole, when you go ahead and take the averages of their overall contributions, when you compare year 1 to year 2, we can quantify it in the idea of these wide receivers getting an uptick of 24% more targets, 26% more receptions, 21% more receiving yards, and 12.11% more receiving touchdowns in their following season. Going from year 1 to year 2, there is a lot of upside in the case of Garrett Wilson because, like I mentioned, some of the variables that are going to be around these players are going to shift. And when you bring in Aaron Rodgers and Nathaniel Hackett, it is absolutely not only going to change the culture of this organization, but the upside that Garrett Wilson presents for fantasy purposes. Now, at this current moment in time, on ESPN Fantasy, his current ADP is 18 overall, on Yahoo 20.6, Sleeper 22.9, and on Underdog 14.0. Obviously, on Underdog, he's being selected extremely early. He's typically coming off the board either as wide receiver 8 through 10. But of course, the prioritization of wide receivers in an Underdog format, considering there's 3 starting wide receivers in that format. And of course, you're starting the best overall player in every single week automatically. You don't have to touch the lineup. So within those overall circumstances, on these other platforms like an ESPN, Yahoo, Sleeper, wherever you draft your redraft leagues, you're going to find the ability to draft Garrett Wilson in the second round, which with these potential upticks of success, not only because he's going into year 2, but because of the improvement at quarterback, could make a huge difference and make him that league-winning archetype. Now, again, last season, he put together an incredible rookie year. Even though he was only averaging 10.25 half PPR fantasy points per game throughout the 17 games that he played, he still finished as the 16th best rookie wide receiver performance in the past decade, which again is impressive. But when we go ahead and separate the quarterbacks in which Garrett Wilson played with and the performances that he had with said corresponding quarterbacks, last season with Zach Wilson at quarterback, Garrett Wilson was not a successful wide receiver, and it's not by accident. Zach Wilson is not a great quarterback. That's why he's the backup, and they brought in Aaron Rodgers this year. He only averaged 6.71 fantasy points per game with Zach Wilson in the 9 contests they played together. Now, with Joe Flacco or Mike White, he was averaging 14.23 half PPR fantasy points per game in those 8 contests. There is a significant difference. If you improve the quarterback position around Garrett Wilson, he's another one of these extremely talented wide receivers that can make another step forward. I mean, in the contest with Joe Flacco and Mike White, in which Garrett Wilson had 5 or more receptions, he was averaging 17.22 fantasy points per game. That level of overall contribution with just little minimal opportunities can very easily be harnessed within this offense. Like I mentioned already, Aaron Rodgers joining this offense with his favorite offensive coordinator, Nathaniel Hackett, who was formerly the offensive coordinator of the Green Bay Packers from 2019 through 2021. Of course, Nathaniel Hackett had a stint with the Denver Broncos last season, was fired, unfortunately. It is what it is. He joins Aaron Rodgers, and they're going to potentially resume exactly what they were accomplishing in that 2019 through 2021 span. And if many of you remember, Aaron Rodgers was the league MVP in 2020 and in 2021, putting together 84 passing touchdowns in 2 seasons. There is a lot of potential within this offense. And when we look at the success of Aaron Rodgers' #1 receiving targets, specifically, I've talked about stats of going all the way back to 2008 and looking at the #1 receiving target of every Aaron Rodgers offense, and those receiving targets averaging 86 receptions, 1,100 receiving yards, and 10 touchdowns a season. But when you go ahead and look at the last 5 healthy seasons where Aaron Rodgers has had a top-tier wide receiver like a Devontae Adams or a Jordy Nelson, I'm not talking about Allen Lazard like last year. I'm talking about a pure wide receiver one like Garrett Wilson is. Those wide receivers per season averaged 151 targets, 104 receptions, nearly 1,300 receiving yards, and 13 touchdowns a season. Those are the kind of numbers that Garrett Wilson will be capable of reaching. And if and when he does, we're talking about a top 5 potential wide receiver that could absolutely crush his current ADP. Now, before we go ahead and talk about another one of these wide receivers that are potentially league-winning upside players, I do want to remind you guys, like I mentioned before, at this current moment in time, if you travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy, you'll have the opportunity to use code Andrew and make a first-time deposit. And if you do so, you're not only going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, you're also going to get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. Again, for those of you who want all of the information that I've collected this offseason in order to set myself up for success in my upcoming 2023 drafts, be sure to go ahead and check this out. At this current moment in time, the draft guide presents all of my methodologies as to how I draft in each of the primary 4 positions: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end, and the statistics that I've gathered over the last decade of fantasy football in order to justify those approach and how I navigate my draft. Additionally, the rankings are by position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defense; by tier: half PPR, full PPR, 4-point per passing touchdown, 6-point per passing touchdown. Additionally, I have top 200 flex rankings, which also includes quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end within those top 200 rankings for both half PPR and a full PPR format. But hey, guess what? The rankings don't stop there. I will be also sending you weekly Sunday morning rankings every week from weeks 1 through 18 of the 2023 fantasy football season, because the singular purpose of this channel is to try to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. So take advantage of the opportunity on hand today. Get the rankings for your upcoming drafts, get the rankings for the entirety of the season, and help yourself capture a fantasy football championship this season. For those of you who are wondering if you're eligible to play, be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen. That'll determine your eligibility based on your current location, and start drafting today responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about the next wide receiver. It is Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, despite the fact that Amon-Ra St. Brown was a part of the list of players that I mentioned in terms of the league-winning archetype last season, players that had an extremely strong finish to the 2021 year, got into their year 2 and expanded upon that even more and flourished as a receiver, I truly do believe that Amon-Ra still has more improvements to make within his overall career and the overall statistics that he could provide for fantasy purposes, making him a league-winning potential superstar in my mind. Amon-Ra St. Brown has a current ADP on ESPN Fantasy of 21.7, Sleeper 17.2, Yahoo 20.6, identical to Garrett Wilson on Yahoo, and on Underdog Fantasy 13.5. He's currently being selected between wide receiver 8 through 10, similar to a Garrett Wilson. And many people in the last couple of days have asked me, Andrew, if I'm selecting one of the two, who do I pick? And my answer is there's no wrong answer. These are both incredible wide receivers that are going to have incredible potential upside and could very easily get into that top 5 conversation. And specifically with Amon-Ra St. Brown going into a full PPR scoring format, he has even more potential upside, because when we look at what he's been able to accomplish in just his first 2 seasons of his career, and despite the fact that he was a late round selection for the Detroit Lions in 2021, he eventually made an impact and absolutely took over the league. We're talking about a wide receiver that has had 196 receptions in the first 2 seasons of his career. That ties with Justin Jefferson and Michael Thomas, who both equally had 196 receptions, both in their rookie years. Now, even though the type of receivers they are different, and we are typically seeing Amon-Ra St. Brown catch the ball far closer to the line of scrimmage in comparison to these other receivers, the potential upside for fantasy purposes is still in line with those level of wide receivers. Now, when we look back to 2021, of course, the hot streak that Amon-Ra St. Brown was on, from weeks 13 through 18 of the 2021 season, a 6-game span, he was averaging 20.93 fantasy points per game. And then he began the 2022 year, continuing that streak of madness where he was averaging 20.53 fantasy points per game. in the first 3 games of the season prior to his injury. Of course, in week 4, got injured, left the game, and was only able to return from injury in week 8. From week 8 through 18, of course, had himself a little bit of a downtick in terms of his overall performances, yet still was able to average 13.5 fantasy points per game, which is wide receiver 1 numbers, which allowed him to get into that overall conversation by the end of the season. But when we go ahead and look at the last 20 healthy games from Amon-Ra St. Brown, going back to week 13 of the 2021 season, 18 of those 20 games, 90%, has consisted of 6 or more receptions in those contests. That's 18 games of 6 receptions minimum, averaging 17.77 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. And even though, again, like I mentioned, he's a little bit of a different receiver than a Michael Thomas and, of course, a Justin Jefferson, because he's lining up in the slot predominantly, and he's catching the ball on, his favorite routes in which he was targeted last season. He was targeted 34 times on an out route, 28 times on a crossing route, and 17 times on a hitch route. He's going to catch the ball very close to the line of scrimmage. That is the receiver he is. He is the Cooper Kupp of this offense for Jared Goff. And in an offense that took steps forward in the passing game, the archetype of allowing a wide receiver to be in that top 12 conversation, if not get into that top 6 conversation, requires an offense that has a quarterback that is going to elevate their game and elevate the receiver. That is why we talked about Garrett Wilson at the capacity that we did, because we do believe Aaron Rodgers could elevate him. But Jared Goff last season proved that he could absolutely elevate Amon-Ra St. Brown. Last season, the Detroit Lions were number 7 amongst all teams in quarterback passing yardage. Additionally, they were number 10 amongst all teams in wide receiver targets, number 8 in wide receiver receptions, number 8 in wide receiver receiving yards. Now, even though they were number 15 in wide receiver receiving touchdowns, I believe that number is only going to increase as we go into this upcoming season based on the efficiency and success that this team has found in the red zone. Specifically, Jared Goff last season amongst all quarterbacks had the 2nd most passing touchdowns inside the 10-yard line, only behind Patrick Mahomes. He had 20 passing touchdowns inside the 10. Additionally, this is an offense that had 61 rushing attempts inside the 10-yard line that led to 19 rushing touchdowns. If and when we expect this backfield of David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs obviously not to be able to accomplish 17 rushing touchdowns from one singular back, and they spread it amongst all the receiving threats within this offense, and they pass more because of the efficiency that they have found down in the red zone, I expect a lot more touchdowns to be within Amon-Ra St. Brown's end of season statistics, and for him to be an absolute monster for fantasy purposes. Additionally, when he has been healthy, specifically in 2022, he was targeted on 30% of the routes that he ran. He had a 2.40 yards per route run average, 8th amongst all wide receivers. He had the 8th most yards after the catch amongst all receiving options with 544, and he had a 73% catch rate, which again, similar to Cooper Kupp, those are the numbers that you want to see when you're playing predominantly in the slot position and able to dominate. When you're able to catch the ball nearly 75%, 3 out of every 4 targets, of course, the fantasy success is only going to continue. And with the vacancy of targets within this offense, again, no more Jamal Williams, no more TJ Hawkinson, no more DJ Chark. There's 111 targets up for grabs. Yes, you bring in Marvin Jones Jr., and he may end up being somewhat of a value piece on the outside, but there are going to be more opportunities for a receiver like Amon-Ra St. Brown, because outside of him, Jahmyr Gibbs, and maybe Sam Laporta, I believe there isn't another wide receiver within this offense that is going to be demanding targets and requires it enough to where it is going to impact Amon-Ra St. Brown in a negative form. Overall, again, with Jameson Williams also being suspended in the first 6 games of the season, it opens up that much more opportunity for Amon-Ra St. Brown to build upon last year and even be better. All right, before we move on to talking about the next wide receiver, I want to remind you guys, like I'm wearing today, the 1.01 brand, the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kiorkof YouTube channel is now available. You can go ahead, travel down to the description of the video, click on the link, heading on over to andrewkiorkofshop.com, and go ahead and not only support the channel, but rep greetings and salutations today. Again, the 1.01 brand is stylish, comfortable, and high-quality clothing for your most stressful of upcoming fantasy football Sundays. So go ahead, support the channel, check out the link down in the description. And if you're interested, the current tie-dye hoodie that I'm currently wearing and is on screen, they're in limited overall capacity. So make sure you go ahead and get yours today. Thank you for supporting. Let's move on. Let's talk about the third wide receiver for today's episode. It is Chris Olave. Chris Olave is a special wide receiver primarily because he's another one of these year 2 players, guys that are going to have that uptake. And like I mentioned with Garrett Wilson, it's a matter of 13 out of the last 15 wide receivers in their rookie seasons since 2017 who have been top 36 in their rookie season have been able to, at an 88% rate, find success in their following year at a potential of 20+% in all 4 main wide receiver statistical categories, whether it is targets, receptions, receiving yards, or receiving touchdowns. And if that's going to take place this year, especially considering the variables that surround Chris Olave are only improving, with Derek Carr coming into the quarterback position in comparison to having Andy Dalton last year, I absolutely believe Chris Olave can make that next step forward. And even though in comparison to where I have him ranked on my tier list that I posted earlier last week, I do believe he has the potential for upside. It's just a matter of whether this offense is going to have enough passes to go around to elevate Chris Olave into becoming one of these wide receivers that have league-winning upside within a given year. So when we look at what Chris Olave was able to accomplish last season amongst all rookie wide receivers in the past decade, he had the 21st best performance. Again, he averaged 10.81 fantasy points per game in the healthy 15 games that he participated in. There were some games in which he left early with an injury or games that he did miss outright. So overall, pretty decent performance. Now, when we look at his overall production, the opportunities that he was given wasn't as high as some of the other upside players within the position, yet he was still given enough opportunity. And when given 6 or more targets within a game, he was averaging 12.37 fantasy points per game, was targeted at that capacity 6 or more times, 11 of his 15 games. So we know that Pete Carmichael, the offensive coordinator of this team and the primary play caller, going into this upcoming year, they're going to continue to use Chris Olave at this capacity. But we have to remember that last season, this was an offense that did not like to pass the ball very much. Amongst all teams in the National Football League, they were ranked 27th in terms of wide receiver targets, 24th in wide receiver receptions, 18th in wide receiver yards, and 19th in wide receiver receiving touchdowns. Now, when we compare that to the Las Vegas Raiders, and of course the influences that Derek Carr may be bringing in, the Las Vegas Raiders last season targeted their wide receivers the 12th most times, 15th most receptions, 11th most receiving yards, and 4th most receiving touchdowns. In fact, Derek Carr in the Las Vegas Raiders last season as an entire quarterback room, whether it was Jarrett Stidham in those last final weeks, that overall organization had the 11th most passing yards amongst all teams in the National Football League in terms of quarterback passing yardage. So if in fact this offense leans towards the proficiencies of Derek Carr and begin to throw even more in 2023 because of the upgrade of the quarterback position, I'm expecting Chris Olave to have himself even more upside. I mean, he's a wide receiver that was targeted on 27.61% of the routes he ran last season, and he had 1,700 air yards total. That was 6th most amongst all wide receivers in the National Football League. Of course, it was an incredible deep receiving threat, mainly when Jameis Winston was the quarterback, but even when he wasn't, he was still given the 8th most targets, 20 or more yards down the field. When you compare that to someone like Davante Adams last season, who was the number 1 receiving option of Derek Carr, Davante Adams had the most touchdowns of 20 or more yards down the field last season. He had 9 of them. If and when these New Orleans Saints make a conscious effort this upcoming season to utilize Chris Olave in that regard, considering Derek Carr last season had the 9th most passing yards, 3rd most passing touchdowns, and 4th most passing attempts, 20 or more yards down the field. If they're able to take advantage of what Derek Carr does best, which is deep passing opportunities, I think Chris Olave will continue to expand upon his game. And even though there are going to be other receivers like a Rashid Shaheed who has deadly speed on the outside, who could end up taking those valuable opportunities down the field, and even Michael Thomas on the other side of the field who will primarily be pulling number 1 coverage, I'm assuming, considering he is still Michael Thomas, and when healthy, he is fantastic. Even though there are going to be other receiving threats within this offense, I still believe Derek Carr could elevate Chris Olave to becoming a league-winning wide receiver. I mean, in the last 3 seasons alone, Derek Carr has had a 100-plus catch receiving option in each of those 3 seasons, with Darren Waller in 2020, Hunter Renfrow in 2021, and of course, Davante Adams last season. All 3 of those options in those given seasons, over 100 receptions. And if you counted them all as wide receivers, we're talking about wide receiver 8, 11, and 3. There is potential here. Therefore, Chris Olave has that league-winning upside going into 2023. Let's move on to Calvin Ridley. Another one of these wide receivers that in my mind is often kind of overlooked at this current moment in time in terms of his ADP via ESPN, Yahoo, Sleeper, even Underdog. ESPN 39.6, Yahoo 40.6, Sleeper 38.0. Now on Underdog it's 23.5, which means he comes off at the back end of the second round, which honestly makes sense. But at this current moment in time on other platforms, being able to get Calvin Ridley in the 4th round is absolutely, in its definition, league-winning upside and a league-winning wide receiver. Because what Calvin Ridley is capable of producing could look very similar to what he was able to do back in 2020 with Matt Ryan in the Atlanta Falcons, where he was the number 4 overall ranked wide receiver at the end of that season in a half PPR scoring format, scoring over 230 fantasy points, having 90 receptions, 1,374 receiving yards, and 9 receiving touchdowns. Again, incredible production, averaging 16.5 fantasy points per game over the course of the 14 games in which he played with the Falcons that year. I mean, when you look at the entire career of Calvin Ridley, in games in which he's been given 7 or more targets since 2018, since joining the Atlanta Falcons, he's been averaging 16.76 half PPR fantasy points per game. Again, he's joining an organization like the Jacksonville Jaguars, who last season targeted their wide receivers the 7th most times. That led to the 7th most wide receiver receptions, 10th most wide receiver receiving yards, and 6th most wide receiver receiving touchdowns. When you look at the archetypes of teams that can support a top 12 flex player at the wide receiver position, the overall contributions that the Jacksonville Jaguars had and that they gave to Christian Kirk, Marvin Jones Jr., and Zay Jones, now that you add the potential of Calvin Ridley, who is the best receiver within this entire receiving core, can absolutely elevate Calvin Ridley into the top 12 wide receiver conversation. I mean, for goodness sake, Christian Kirk was a top 12 wide receiver last season, finished as wide receiver 11 overall within an offense that threw the ball and had the 12th most passing yards amongst all teams in the National Football League, in an offense that, again, was the first time that Trevor Lawrence had been in a Doug Peterson offense. He had the full offseason, but sure, that's only his first year within the system. If you go into another year with Trevor Lawrence getting even more comfortable and finding himself in an even greater relationship with Doug Peterson, the quarterback whisperer, as I like to call him, considering what he's been able to do in his career with guys like Carson Wentz, and of course, guys like, Nick Foles going to the Super Bowl and winning it all. I truly believe there's a lot of upside for Calvin Ridley, especially considering the target vacancy. No Marvin Jones Jr., no Arnold, no Manhurts. These are opportunities that lead to 100 potential vacated targets. And when we talk about coming in and becoming the number one outside receiving option, and considering Zay Jones had 121 targets last year, if you shave off 20 of those targets off Zay Jones, Christian Kirk had himself 133 targets. Even if you shave off just a couple of those overall opportunities, plus the vacated opportunities that will be available, I'm anticipating 140 targets going in the direction of Calvin Ridley. And if he can be just as efficient as he was in seasons past, which again, I know he's missed some times due to the suspension and of course taking away time, just to kind of go ahead and reset his mental health. So despite the fact that he has missed time, I truly think that he can immediately make an impact as the number one outside receiver of this offense that loves to throw the ball deep. Last season, Trevor Lawrence had the 5th most passing attempts, 20 or more yards down the field. And of course, the last time Calvin Ridley was the number 4 overall wide receiver in fantasy football back in 2020, he was number 1 in targets, 20 or more yards down the field. He was number 1 in receptions in that category, number 2 in receiving yards. There is a lot of potential here, especially when we talk about Trevor Lawrence going from year 2 to year 3 and that perfect sweet spot of a quarterback getting the elite wide receiver in their year 3 season and taking even further steps forward. Calvin Ridley is in line for a league-winning season here. Moving on, let's talk about Christian Watson. Another one of these year 2 wide receivers who, again, like we've talked about, if a wide receiver over the course of the last 5 seasons, 2017 through 2021, going into their second year, were in their rookie season already a top 36 standing receiver, and then followed it up the following season, we saw 13, of course, of those 17 wide receivers find themselves success and once again be top 36 players within the following year. 13 of those 15 players, of course, were healthy and were able to accomplish that. Of course, that's an 88% success rate. I've already gone ahead and mentioned that twice already with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, but I once again want to mention it because the potential of a 20% increase in targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns for someone like Christian Watson would be unbelievable, especially considering where he finished last season as wide receiver 34 with 143.6 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format, defying all the odds of the rookie wide receiver on the Green Bay Packers associated with Aaron Rodgers, all of the facts that we had in the past, all the misconceptions that, hey, there's never going to be a wide receiver that is going to be able to find success with Aaron Rodgers because he just doesn't allow for it. That all was put to rest as Christian Watson pretty much broke the mold. I mean, even though from weeks 1 through 9, the continuous streak of Aaron Rodgers not really finding success with the rookie wide receiver continued with him as he was wide receiver 110 overall, averaging only 3.62 fantasy points per game. But from weeks 10 through 18, everything changed, averaging 15.24 fantasy points per game. Any game in which he was given 6 or more targets, averaging 17 fantasy points per game. Any game in which he played 80% or more of the offensive snaps, averaging 18.7 fantasy points per game. He is a special wide receiver. He is a top-tier elite athlete. Size, speed, the ability to catch, he can do it all. It's just going to be a matter of, can the Green Bay Packers give him enough opportunity to be the elite wide receiver that we know he's capable of? I mean, since LaFleur has come into this offense and become the head coach and the primary play caller for the Green Bay Packers since 2019, I mean, again, they've targeted their wide receivers the 15th most times. They've had the 17th most receptions, 13th most receiving yards, and 5th most receiving touchdowns. Of course, a lot of that statistics have been accumulated by Davante Adams, as his team has very rarely ever had a wide receiver 2 that's been consistent. In fact, the wide receiver 2 of this team has pretty much been Aaron Jones the last 4 consecutive years. But going into this upcoming season with Jordan Love, with a little bit of a change in terms of the overall kind of pace of this offense. Yes, there are going to be times in which this offense will struggle, but I truly think the last 3 years of Jordan Love sitting and watching and learning from Aaron Rodgers will be immediately implemented. I mean, when we're talking about a wide receiver who was targeted on 24.44% of the overall routes he ran, he had a 2.26 yard per route run average, which was 11th amongst all wide receivers last season. And you have 224 potential targets vacated with no more Randall Cobb, Allen Lazard, Mercedes Lewis, and of course Robert Tonyan available. I think Jordan Love in an offense that is going to be set up for success primarily because of their strength of schedule. They have the third easiest quarterback strength of schedule amongst all teams in the National Football League and the second easiest strength of schedule amongst all wide receivers in the National Football League. I think this combo should absolutely be able to elevate, considering the fact that Christian Watson currently on ESPN Fantasy has an ADP of 52, on Sleeper 61, Yahoo 78, and only on Underdog is it 40. He is still being drafted far later than he should be, especially like on Yahoo, 78, wide receiver 28 overall. That's where you steal this wide receiver. Someone who came upon the 2022 season late, but had a strong finish, similar to someone that's perhaps just above him in the overall graphic, like an AMON-RA St. Brown, who can, in year 2, continue that success for the entirety and can find himself that league-winning upside for 2023. Moving on, let's talk about Diontae Johnson. Again, every single year, I am always on the Diontae Johnson hype train because what he is able to acquire in terms of opportunity in comparison to, in fact, all of the wide receivers that are on the screen today is just different. The last 3 consecutive seasons, he has had 144 targets minimum every single year. And that level of opportunity is not going to change this upcoming season. As a wide receiver who's being selected in terms of ADP, as wide receiver 23, 34, 30, and 26 on all 4 of these different platforms, coming off the board as ESPN ADP 61 overall. On Sleeper, 80. On Yahoo, 83. On Underdog, 53. These overall opportunities to grab Diontae Johnson as late as we possibly can is absolutely going to pay dividends for our 2023 campaigns, especially considering last season, he had 147 targets, just as much as Garrett Wilson. Yet, we don't really talk about Diontae Johnson in the same capacity as Garrett Wilson. And I understand why. Of course, there is a difference in terms of skill. And at the quarterback position, there is certainly a difference in terms of who's commanding that offense. But I truly do believe being selected as wide receiver 30, 34 is completely out of the realm of possibility as to where Diontae Johnson is absolutely going to finish by the end of 2023, which makes him a potential league-winning candidate who has upside that could get him into that top-tier wide receiver 2 conversation. Let's talk about this. Last season, Diontae Johnson hurt many of us for fantasy purposes, primarily because he scored 0 touchdowns. Going back to 2009, there has never been a wide receiver in NFL history that has had 130 or more targets and 0 touchdowns in a year since Diontae Johnson in 2022. Now, when we go ahead and look at all those wide receivers, the 147 of them that were able to accumulate 130 or more targets in a given season, those wide receivers over the course of since 2009 to 2022 averaged about 7.8 receiving touchdowns per season. I truly believe that Diontae Johnson is being slept on. Amongst all receiving options, he is pretty much this season's Miles Sanders. Miles Sanders in 2021 had 0 rushing touchdowns, and in 2022 was selected as a player that was an RB3. And what did he do? He became the RB13 overall with over 1,200 rushing yards, over 11 rushing touchdowns. Those are the kind of numbers that potentially could be in line for someone like Diontae Johnson because we know the targets are going to be there. Last season, in the 10 healthy games that Kenny Pickett played, he was targeting Diontae Johnson 8.5 targets per game, which is on average in a 17-game season, 145 targets. So we know the targets are going to be there. And when, in fact, he finds the end zone this season, despite the unlucky nature of those variables in 2022, I'm expecting Diontae Johnson to far and away outproduce his current ADP. And again, Matt Canada has had him be the number 1 receiver of this offense for 3 consecutive years for a reason. Whether it's with Big Ben or whether it's with Kenny Pickett is taking steps forward. He's going to improve upon his 63% passing completion percentage last year in the 10 healthy games that he played. We've already seen it this offseason. Kenny Pickett in the preseason is playing incredibly well, and I expect this entire offense and even defense, the improvements they've made there, it's only going to help elevate all of the fantasy options within this offense. And let's not forget, last season, the Pittsburgh Steelers quite literally only had 12 passing touchdowns in the season. I mean, if you take into account the fact that Patrick Mahomes had 41 passing touchdowns, we can see a pretty clear difference. But I truly do believe Kenny Pickett will take steps forward. And following along will be Diontae Johnson. The final wide receiver I wanted to mention is another player that I really love going into this year. It is Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin's current ADP sits at wide receiver 24, 27, 26, 31. He's often being slept on, and in my mind, going into this upcoming year, I can understand why. You no longer have Tom Brady. Tom Brady, who was able to elevate this offense in the last 3 seasons that have the second most passing yards amongst all teams, the second most wide receiver targets, the second most wide receiver receptions, receiving yards, 4th most wide receiver receiving touchdowns. All of these statistics are no longer going to be capable of achieving with Tom Brady no longer being there, and of course, Baker Mayfield now being the starting quarterback. But with that being said, I do believe, and I've said this before, I do believe Chris Godwin is going to be Tyler Lockett this year. He's going to be a receiver that many of us have slept on and many of us have looked past, and is going to be able to benefit despite the fact that his quarterback play is far less. Maybe even Baker Mayfield able to find himself success this season due to the fact that Dave Canales, who is currently the offensive coordinator, taking over from Byron Leftwich, who was the former offensive coordinator of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's coming in as the former quarterbacks coach of the Seattle Seahawks last season, who was able to help Geno Smith take steps forward. If we can get Baker Mayfield back to his 2018 through 2020 years, in which with the Cleveland Browns, this guy was putting up a base minimum of 3,500 passing yards and 22 passing touchdowns throughout those seasons, I do believe he can elevate Chris Godwin to being a wide receiver too. I mean, you go back to 2018 and 2019. Jarvis Landry was the number one receiving option of Baker Mayfield in those seasons, averaging 82 receptions, 1,075 receiving yards, and 5 receiving touchdowns, finishing as wide receiver 19 and 13 throughout those 2 seasons, playing primarily from the slot position about 65% of the routes that he ran. That's exactly the kind of utilization that we are seeing from Chris Godwin and will continue to see. Another season removed from the ACL injury, and considering the fact that Russell Gage had a season-ending injury this offseason, there really isn't going to be anybody else contesting Chris Godwin in the slot position. A wide receiver that is going to find himself open very often, and despite the overall quarterback play, has found his most successful season back in 2019 with Jameis Winston. If Chris Godwin is fully healthy for this upcoming season, considering this team has the 3rd easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position, on top of the fact that really outside of Mike Evans, Rashad White out of the backfield, and of course Chris Godwin, there are really no other options within this offense that are going to compete for a high volume of targets. Therefore, I truly do believe Chris Godwin going at wide receiver 31 on Underdog, 27 on Yahoo. These are numbers that really can be crushed, making him a league-winning potential wide receiver option. All right, guys, that's going to cover for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. The final thing I wanted to mention, again, do not forget, at this current moment in time, you can get your hands on my 2023 Fantasy Football Draft Guide and rankings every single week from weeks 1 through 18, sent from my email to yours personally every single Sunday morning, so that I'm able to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. Regardless of what you're doing on Sundays this upcoming season, you'll be equipped with all the information possible in terms of rankings, flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR, in order to lead to your success. All you got to do, use code Andrew, make that first-time deposit via Underdog Fantasy, minimum of $10, and start drafting today in regards to one of their potential best ball leagues, whether it's Best Ball Mania 4 or potentially one of the other leagues, the Puppy Leagues, the Pomeranians, all of those. Check it out today. Gain some experience prior to your leagues. And until next time, we'll be talking about some sleeper options tomorrow. I'll see you guys. Peace.